So probably a month ago now, I made a video talking about how Blizzard was changing Myth Track to be from 4 out of 4 to 6 out of 6, and how that was actually pretty negatively impacting Mythic Plus players. Blizzard since walked that back a little bit, and they changed Profession Gear to be 636. Initially, the Profession Gear was going to be like 629 or something like that, so like actually a fair amount behind where it was relative in Dragonflight. And now, since then, Blizzard actually changed it to where it's going to end up being the equivalent of Myth 5 out of 6, so it's going to be 636. It's going to be 3 item levels behind. That's great. But the fact of the matter still stands, where Heroic is still 6 out of 6, Myth Track is still 6 out of 6, so there's no Heroic 8 out of 8. And so basically, Heroic caps out at 626, Mythic caps out at 639. And if you go to Dungeon Journal, you can see this, and basically all Myth Track gear is capping out at 639. And so while the expansion is launched, I kind of wanted to take some time to kind of talk about what the actual changes are for how this affects Mythic Plus players. Because I watched this video from Nagura, and she had a dev interview with George Velov and Michael Bybee, and basically George ended up talking about Mythic raid tuning and how gear ends up impacting this. Because I think that the situation that has happened for raid for the past couple of tiers is that we have actually not gotten into a late state of farm for raid. And that's due to a couple of factors, but it particularly boils down to the fact that players are getting a lot of gear really early, and that makes the later parts of the raid relatively difficult to tune for a larger portion of the player base. Whereas in the past, if you look back to expansions like Legion, like BFA, you would enter this state of deep farm where you're like speed killing bosses. You're killing bosses in 2 minutes, you're killing bosses in 3 minutes, and that was actually pretty valuable. But we haven't had that over the past couple of tiers, and so people were looking for that to kind of return, particularly whenever you start to get close to BIS level gearing. And so I'm just going to play this part where George Velov and Michael Bybee are talking about gearing, and then I kind of want to explain how this impacts not only raid players but Mythic Plus players, and basically what these groups of players are looking for with gearing. So just to kind of set this up, Nagura asks a question basically talking about, what's the task of tuning Mythic Raid looking like? How difficult has it been over the past couple of tiers? What are you looking like whenever you're trying to tune the raid for multiple different core groups of people that play the game, whether it be raiders, whether it be like race rule first players, whether it be just like casual Mythic raiders? Like, what exactly does that look like? And then this is basically George's response.
There is a very wide range of players. There's the race rule first folks, and there's folks who are pushing Hall of Fame, and there's folks who are just doing Mythic normally, and that's just Mythic flow. So there's a very wide range of skill expressions among players. And it is something we consider. It's, why after certain bosses have been defeated at the race world first, we do sort of gradual or, sometimes heavy nerfs. That's sort of the plan. It's something to keep in mind. This time around, our approach is to use the Severed Strands buff, which is sort of I think that's what it is. It's the gradual sort of buffing of player damage and healing over the course of the raid. So like months into the raid, your damaging needs to go up a little bit. And that gives us basically more agency where players feel like they're getting stronger, and we don't have to sort of like keep nerfing bosses for the players to make sure they're making progress. So yeah,
So basically, George cites this thing called Shredded Strands debuff. Basically, if you haven't seen, there's been a couple of interviews that have talked about this. Whenever you kill a couple of bosses in a raid per week, you end up getting buffed up gradually over time. Kind of think of it as the defense matrix from BFA from the old year season, where every week you end up getting progressively a little bit stronger as you enter the raid. What this does is over time it allows you to kind of enter this period of deep farm, because this thing that Blizzard's done is they've actually been struggling with the early couple of bosses, making them, I would say, easy enough, especially once you approach Mythic, like full Myth Track level gear, because a lot more players, I think, have access to deep farm levels of gear relatively early, which is good inherently, but it's weird for tuning. And so then whenever George is talking about like the Shredded Strands debuff and making sure that it's allowing for raiders in particular to get this better gear or get this increased power level, that's actually an important thing. But however, whenever you go and look at the Mythic gear that you're getting from the end bosses of Mythic, and you're getting all of this Myth Track gear, Myth Track going to 6 out of 6 instead of 4 out of 4 now, basically all items can become very rare items and have this 13 item level delta. And so then whenever you talk about this in terms of Mythic Plus is only on Hero Track. So this is pretty bad for Mythic Plus for a couple of slots of gear. I would say particularly for the trinkets, and particularly for tier pieces that you don't loot from the vault. basically you're going to end up being beholden to the vault as a Mythic Plus player, meaning that all of your theoretical BIS is coming from the vault at any given moment, and you don't really have opportunities to be able to get late farm myth track gear. And funnily enough, I actually think that for Raid and Mythic Plus, the importance of eye level is, I would argue, almost in direct opposition of depending on the week of the season. And this is kind of this weird situation where Mythic Raiders, you see them complaining about having to do Mythic Plus, especially early on in the season, where they're complaining that they have to do 30, 40, 50, potentially even like 60 dungeons to farm very specific gear on Hero Track. And that's going to end up helping them. That's why they wanted things like a Heroic Week to return. That's why they wanted Mythic Plus loot to actually be nerfed in some aspects, is because they actually don't want to be farming this gear. And so like I think that the best way to do this is kind of like draw a diagram. So like red will end up being Raiders, where the importance of item level as you start out the season, it starts off really important, right? And then as you get into this deep farm, maybe the importance of item level drops off a little bit, and then there's like this plateau, right? And so this is like the Raiders arc, where these people do raid. Okay, so this is the Raiders and how their gearing works, where early on in the season, getting this loot from Mythic Plus is actually important. And so for them, the best thing that they can do is spam Mythic Plus as long as possible to be able to get that gear. For Mythic Plus players, it's kind of the opposite thing, where they actually want to be raiding in a lot of aspects, and we'll use them as blue. And so basically their season starts off slow, right? Because they're waiting to get their tier sets. They're waiting to get myth track pieces of gear. The season, you don't really start pushing super early on in the season. And I actually think that that's probably problematic, but it's impossible for people to push early on in the season. You're kind of just waiting to get more gear. So the season starts off really slow. And then as you get to about the week, 10, 11, 12 mark, then people really start to pick up, starting to push. And then as the season gets longer and longer, maybe you start to end up in like the later part of the season. But this is the part where you need to be like capped on your gear, right? This is like gear cap, where to clear Mythic Raid, you actually don't really have to hit that gear cap. To be a Hall of Fame level raider, you just need, half of your gear to be on that myth track level gear. But for Mythic Plus players, they want all of their pieces to be on that myth track level gear, because they're looking for gear cap, whereas raid players, they're looking to be able to finish progression. And I think that that's like a very different thing. And by killing bosses like a couple of weeks earlier in the raid, that actually ends up helping you with that gear progression. And so that's why I think that for a lot of people, they kind of talk about how this change actually negatively impacts Mythic Plus players whenever it's going to Myth 6 out of 6. And for some people, it just kind of goes over their head as to why. Because ultimately, if you're wearing this heroic level gear, so say you actually end up going and you're wearing the 626 item level gear, you're missing 13 item levels in your trinket slots. You're missing 13 item levels in your tier slots. You're actually ended up missing a lot of stamina. You end up missing a lot of damage. And basically for Mythic Plus players, they're playing for gear cap. And that's why you hear Mythic Plus players talk about feeling like they have to raid every single season. That's why they feel like they have to raid, where raiders end up talking like they feel like they have to do Mythic Plus. And that's why raiders are like, oh yeah, we have to do Mythic Plus, because whenever gear is this important at the beginning of the season for raid, of course they're going to feel like they have to do the content that gives you spammable gear. And then of course for Mythic Plus players, whenever the gear is this important at the beginning of the season but this important at the end of the season, of course they're going to feel like they have to raid, because they're going to be able to get closer to gear cap, because raid has the theoretical gear cap. The Mythic Plus system does not let you get to gear cap. You are basically praying to God that the vault will award you gear that's close enough. Anyways, that's my rant about gearing. I hope the expansion launch has been great for everybody. Hope everybody's been having a lot of fun with the expansion. I just wanted to take some time to talk about end-game gearing stuff, because I think people have been kind of interested on this topic. I saw it in this Nagura interview, and I thought that this was a good time to talk about it. Anyhow, that's going to be it for me today. Hope to see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.